Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to a very special double episode of the Human Risk podcast. Since the show is approaching its 200th episode, what you're listening to now is the 199th, I thought it was a good time to celebrate. So I did what we always do when we celebrate special occasions and decided to replicate the winning formula I used last time. On the 99th and 100th shows, I was joined by behavioural science gurus and good friends of each other and the show, Rory Sutherland and Gerald Ashley. Since then, I've also recorded a doubleheader with Gerald and his and Rory's good friend Paul Craven. Like Rory and Gerald, Paul has also done a solo appearance on the show. So I thought I'd complete the set, and on this episode and the next, I'm joined by Rory Sutherland and Paul Craven. Rory is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy, and Paul has over 30 years of financial services experience, having worked at Schroders, PIMCO and Goldman Sachs. Both are behavioural science practitioners that help bring creative problem solving to business. If you've heard either of them before, and if you haven't, there are links to all of their appearances in the show notes, then you'll know you're in for a free-range discussion that is jam-packed with behavioural insights. When I say free-range, it's really a case of me just letting two brilliant conversationalists do their thing. In our discussion, and I literally just mean this episode, we discuss framing, ethics, sludge, electric cars, the best joke at this year's Edinburgh Festival, gotta warn you, it's an adult joke, the pratfall effect, or why making mistakes can make us seem more human, how one man saved the world from a nuclear war, the Beatles, how we look at data, and a whole lot more. Whenever I record with Paul or Rory, it almost takes me longer to put the show notes together than edit the show. There are that many interesting references that you're probably going to want to dive into. We begin the show by talking about magic and alchemy. Paul is a magician and a member of the prestigious Magic Circle. Meanwhile, Rory has written a book called Alchemy. So I wanted to explore what the differences and similarities between the two are. So please enjoy, as I know you will, the 199th episode of the Human Risk podcast featuring magician Paul Craven and alchemist Rory Sutherland. Rory and Paul, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to be back.
It occurred to me that getting you both together, of course, is combining Paul the magician and Rory the alchemist. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the difference between those, or the similarities.
They're very similar, and I suppose what it all boils down to is, one, the whole question of epistemology and perception, which is we don't see what's objectively there, we see what we notice and what our evolved brain wants us to see. Okay, which means that therefore, if there isn't an absolutely straightforward relationship between reality and perception, exclusively trying to improve human experience by tweaking reality is not necessarily a safe approach. And the second thing, I suppose, is that the point of alchemy is that we tend to have, as the economist Nicholas Gruen said, we've borrowed from economics the idea of trade-offs, and we tend to see trade-offs everywhere. And as a result, we tend to discount things which are magical because they don't involve a trade-off. You know, I would regard, in some senses, okay, the Uber map is magical because it doesn't cost very much to provide. It doesn't change the objective reality of how quickly your taxi turns up. But psychologically, it completely transforms the quality of your waiting. Okay, so in a sense, you could have done that by having a predictive algorithm. Now, you know, in order to do this, you need to spend a lot of money and you'd have to have a hell of a lot of cabs. Okay, a predictive algorithm which sends taxis to areas where high demand is expected so that you can reduce people's objective wait for a taxi. And that wouldn't be a totally stupid thing to do, by the way. I'm not suggesting it's a complete waste of time. But a complementary approach is to say, if we can't actually reduce significantly the quantity of the wait, let's change the quality of waiting. And so the point I make is that if you look for engineering solutions, there tends to be a trade-off. You need more taxis. You need a certain surplus of taxis, perhaps, to make that work. And so we tend to look for those solutions because we're comfortable with things that are non-magical, that involve a trade-off between, price and utility or whatever. And my argument is, if you understand the vagaries and peculiarities of human perception well enough, you don't need to be constrained by those real-world, costly trade-off solutions. You can actually, every now and then, you can generate a bit of magic.
I think I'd probably start off by quoting probably the father of modern magic, who was a 19th century French magician called Jean-Eugène Robin Houdin. And he came up with a phrase that has always fascinated me. He said, a magician is an actor playing the part of a magician. And the more I think about that, the better it is, because one of the reasons I like magic so much, and it's been my hobby, and I'm a member of the Magic Circle, and I hang out with lots of magicians, is actually it ties in very much with my love of behavioural science. Because I think so much of behavioural science is about perception, context, and a magician looks at the world in ways that perhaps some other people don't. And I think that some of the things I've learned in magic have helped me with my behavioural science, and some things I've gleaned along the way in my behavioural science career have helped me with my magic. And that Houdin quotation is quite famous amongst magicians, but there's a less famous one that he said once. And he said, a fundamental understanding of the human psyche is the essential key to successful magic. And I think I could easily transpose that to say, a fundamental understanding of the human psyche is the essential key to behavioural science.
There's something that occurs to me, it's something interesting about sort of both magic and alchemy, is that we have this sort of reveal moment where you realize that something has happened. And one of the interesting things about behavioral science is, of course, that often we don't realize it, that things are just happening in the background. And so I think it's very interesting that there are two disciplines, for want of a better phrase, that are all about showing you the trick. I'm not going to tell you how it's done, but I'm going to amaze you. There's going to be an aha moment or a what the hell happened moment. But often with behavioral science, it just occurs, and yet it's using similar techniques.
Yeah, one thing I would say there, I remember when I was last on your podcast, Christian, and your friend and my friend Gerald Ashley accused magicians of being con men. And I actually, with a smile on my face, took some exception to that, because I do think that when one is watching a magician, there's an honest contract between performer and audience. Audience knows magician is going to try and fool him or her. Magician, he or she will try and fool the audience in an honest contract. They both know the terms of the engagement.
You could, by the way, say the same thing about advertising when you know it's an advertisement.
Interesting.
In other words, people read and decode advertisements knowing that the person is putting their best foot forward, that they aren't necessarily, but they find nonetheless the process useful, provided you know the terms under which the engagement takes place. Now, advertorial, for example, or PR, or for that matter, the manipulation of the press, is a slightly different matter, because it doesn't take place in that context where there is a kind of unspoken contract between the person producing the medium and an explicit understanding of what's going on between the person producing the communication and the person consuming it.
Yes, I think that's very true. And indeed, what's one of the controversies of, for example, say the nudge unit, is that the idea being that are we being gently and persuasively convinced to do the right thing, or is there some sort of, and I'll use this phrase very loosely, mind control going on? I happen to personally think that you can use behavioural science in a very honest, ethical way. You can make it that honest contract I talked about. But I think there is a risk sometimes it's perceived, or it can actually be perceived by its promoters as being something a little bit more sinister. And that's obviously an area of controversy amongst the behavioural scientists that I've certainly spoken to. And I think it's something that may be worthy of further discussion.
I think that's very fair, because now you can make the counterpoint, which is that the context in which we make decisions nudges us whether we like it or not, the way in which the choice architecture is designed, the comparative frame, etc. Okay, when you read a thing that says outside Marks and Spencer's, dine in for two for £10, okay, what they're doing there is they're framing the cost of M&S not against Aldi or Lidl, but against going out for a restaurant meal or getting a Deliveroo, okay? And, okay, that undoubtedly presents Marks and Spencer's generally premium prices in a more favourable light than, making a direct comparison with, what you might pay at Aldi for the same thing. But equally, there is this inevitable process which we might as well understand, because one of the worst things you can do, I think, and I think this is possible, is you can actually produce a very good product and then present it in such a way that it is completely unappealing.
Yeah, and I mean, in the words of someone we know of, Gregory Bateson, who said, without context, words and actions have no meaning at all.
No.
So you've got to use some words in some context to frame anything.
There's always a context. Yeah, I mean...
Yeah, there has to be. And so that's why I come down on the side of behavioural science being a really beneficial thing, potentially, as opposed to some of its critics who say we need to beware because it's there is something untoward about it. And it was de Bono, didn't he, who said that communication is always understood in the context and experience of the receiver, no matter what was intended. So if we're trying to get a message across, we have to be more persuasive, more creative, a better communicator. And all those things are considered to be good things in a sort of business context, a presentation context. So why not use this stuff to be more persuasive? And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm most interested in it.
And by the way, I mean, one of the things you can use behavioural science to spot once you understand it is what Thaler calls sludge, which is his great example of sludge is online publications, which are very easy to subscribe to with an introductory $1 a month offer, where the price then ramps up to $9.95 after 3 months, and it is almost impossible to cancel that subscription without some transatlantic phone call. Now, actually, what you have there is a market failure. I would argue it may require legislation, which I think the Germans have introduced, which is it must be basically as easy to cancel a subscription as it is to actually enact one. I would also argue, by the way, that recurring credit card payments should be marked as recurring on your credit card bill, and you should be able online to cancel them just by clicking alongside them, as you can do with a direct debit or a standing order. Now, you might say, why am I, an advertising person who's supposed to have the interests of the business at heart, why am I proposing intervention there? Well, the argument is that I think what is happening is you're killing the whole subscription model. Because people have learnt that fact, they've learnt the fact that it's sludgy, and they're now disproportionately reluctant to subscribe to anything. Because they go, no, I like that $1 a month offer for 6 months. To be honest, this thing might be worth $9.99 a month, but there's no way I'm getting into something which I can't get out of. And so what you're actually doing is you're damaging the wider sector of publications by playing a short-term game. And so, one of the most important things I think you can do is spot where there is a contextual problem that effectively prevents wider action, that prevents people from making good decisions.
But that's really interesting in terms of regulation, right? Because that requires some behavioural insight. So you would only introduce that regulation if you recognise that failure, and that requires an understanding of the psychology of why people behave the way they do.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, undoubtedly, inertia is a powerful human force, okay? And if you have a subscription of around about $9.99 a month, it's not at the level of £100 a month, £500 a month, where it is worth an afternoon going to cancel it. You're very inclined to go, I'll cancel that next month because it's going to be a pain in the arse. And so it is important that you need to understand behavioural science to understand where it's being misused.
Yes.
Just as much as you need to understand it to understand where to use it.
I think that's a really good point, and I think we need to. I think you've just explained that beautifully, because it is getting a bit of a bad press in some quarters these days. Not least over the whole COVID thing, and I think we need to distinguish between the behavioural science and the people that ask the behavioural scientists to do something.
I'll give you an example of this, actually, which is electric cars have become absolutely fixated on range as the competitive USP. Okay? Now, my argument would be this is actually creating a behavioural bias, which is making electric cars in, for example, the UK and the Netherlands, more expensive and heavier and less accessible than they need to be. And my argument there is that what has happened, effectively, nearly all technology, any new technology, requires extensive marketing. Because we forget that in retrospect. Once the technology becomes universal, we completely forget the fact that there was a time when fridges needed to be marketed. Okay? If you moved into a house without a fridge or a kettle, Okay, you just go, this is bloody ridiculous. And day one, you'd go out and buy a fridge. There was a period, my father was telling me, in 1953, his best friend from university was a wealthy Harrovian whose father was a Harley Street specialist who owned half of a house in Harley Street, but they didn't have a fridge. I go, what? Okay, I said, you're serious? And the interesting thing is, we always forget this. We forget that mobile phones, that back in the late 80s, early 90s, the majority of people would go, I think mobile phones are stupid. Why do I want to make a phone call on the street? Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, Edison, they were all hucksters and salesmen, every bit as much as they were inventors. Okay? And with electric cars, I think we have this fundamental problem, which is 95% of the time we never drive more than 100 miles in a day anyway. Okay, 99% of the time in some people's cases. And secondly, we've missed the fact that the UK and the Netherlands are fundamentally different countries to the United States. And so we've imported a rational fear from the United States. I'm going to get stuck at a truck stop in Idaho at 11 o'clock at night when a serial killer has just escaped from prison, and I'm going to discover that the rapid charger's out of order, okay? Versus Britain, where you just go, oh, look, this one isn't working. There's a pub 8 miles down the road. Because the population density is so different.
Because we British need an excuse to visit the pub, don't we?
Yeah. Can I tell the best joke from the Edinburgh Festival, by the way?
Go on.
This is mischievous, but it's very, very funny, okay? Which is a Spanish comedian who said that dogging is the most British thing you can possibly imagine. He said, what other country in the world would take an orgy and think, how can we make this more like a car boot sale?
I don't know how I'm going to explain that in the show notes, but I'll put a link.
I don't know how you're going to show that in the show notes, but I just think it's a perfect observation. I think it's just flawless.
Here's a cleaner joke, and it's in the context of framing. It just occurred to me, Fizzle, and someone said to me the other day, said, when the Titanic went down, those live lobsters in the kitchen thought it was a bloody miracle.
Actually, funnily enough, that is actually rather interesting, because one of the things I've been involved in transport is we completely forget the fact that when a flight is delayed or a train is late, there are certain people who are beneficiaries. If you thought you were going to miss your train or you thought you were going to miss your flight, there are probably 8 people on every flight who go, thank God this flight was delayed. And yet it's never factored into the calculus at all. Now, I'm not saying that the lobster's interests actually, okay, someone's going to say too soon, but I think, I'm not going to say the lobster's interests should be given priority over the interests of the passengers, okay? But nonetheless, it is an interesting point that we're inclined always to look at the upside or the downside of anything exclusively without considering, wider areas of comparison.
There was the comedian Robin Ince, actually, I think he put on his Facebook post a few months ago. He was talking about going on stage and the microphone wouldn't work. And I was quite interested because what he posted, and I suspect he was being 100% honest with this, he said, actually, when I realised my microphone wasn't on, I always think it's a good thing or wasn't working because something unexpected like that sharpens my mind. In other words, rather than saying it was a bad thing, I actually even more geared up for what I'm about to do, which is to engage with the audience, to communicate. And I thought about my own experience because I once I was doing one of my talks a few years ago, and it was actually on a boat on the Thames, and the whole system broke down. The sound, they'd propped up a computer with a screen, everything went down, and there was a sort of audience of about 30 or 40 on the boat, and I was doing a sort of evening talk. And I remember it well because I actually started smiling, thinking, this is quite interesting because I'm not nearly as concerned as the organisers are. They're rushing around now trying to plug bits in. And I could see the audience feeling very sympathetic towards me. And I'm smiling back at them.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, and I just said after about, half a minute or so, look, there's no point. Let's just do it without slides, do it without volume. We don't need it. And everybody sort of was so relieved and relaxed after that. And it made for a great evening. And so sometimes when something does go wrong, and you talked about the flight being late, just by reframing it, you could make something much, much better. And I think isn't that one of the great virtues of behavioural science? It teaches us, it shows examples of how we can reframe things in almost any context, whether it be business, health, food, anything that can be reframed and change the context, and therefore you completely change the perception of it.
Funnily enough, I've got a counterpoint story to that, which is interesting, which is in all my days of attending, conferences and public speaking, I've only ever seen one guy completely lose the audience. And it was a guy whose AV went wrong and he started shouting at the AV guys. Okay? He had a go at the AV guys. He said, if you could actually manage to get these slides changed instead of being... And he basically insulted the AV guys, which was a kind of de haut en bas. It violated all... Now, if you actually go, don't worry, guys, I'll take care of this. We can do this without amplification. Okay? You're absolutely right. You've got audience sympathy to begin with. And you start from a better place. And actually, this guy, it was so interesting because I've never seen anybody on any other occasion lose an audience to the extent this guy did. It was actually tragic.
But I mean, there are people that do that deliberately.
Yeah.
That insert what looks like a screw up to create that dynamic.
Famously, the advertising agency Allen Brady and Marsh, which was founded by two of the three founders, had a background in theatre. And their pitches literally had little crosses of tape on the floor to tell you where to stand at a particular point. And they learnt the pratfall effect, and they realised that their presentations were so slick it was actually arousing suspicion or discomfort. And they built in, I'll hand these boards to you, and that's when you drop them and make a little joke. And they actually had to build in little cock-ups because it just felt so stage managed in a sense that it no longer felt comfortable to the audience.
There's something very similar actually in Sammy Davis Jr.'s autobiography. When early in his career, he came off stage and was met by, I think it was Jerry Lewis, who said to him, "Tonight your performance was letter perfect." And Davis sort of smiles and he said, "That was terrible." And Lewis said to him, "You've got to make some mistakes on stage, and some things that look like they've never happened before. Because if you do, the audience will unroof you a lot more." And Davis never forgot that and wrote about it in his autobiography, saying, I try and do mistakes occasionally, make them look like unintentional mistakes, because that way I can gain the audience's sympathy. I suppose there's a bit of the pratfall effect in there, isn't there? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's also the difference, I suspect, between live performance. In other words, a performance with slight mistakes feels live. It's very hard to explain, but I'm a very big fan of going along and watching live broadcasts of opera or theatre to cinemas, but I'm not really that interested in going along and seeing recorded broadcasts, as it were.
Okay.
Because there's something about the fact that Formula One would be the most extreme case, okay? Very, very different watching it live when anything can happen versus watching it recorded. And there's a wonderful group, I think it might be UCL, who've actually done a whole load of research on things like galvanic skin response when you're watching a live performance versus when you're watching a recorded one. There's a degree of kind of alertness that possibly just comes in that you can't really...
I'm minded of... That's interesting because we were just talking before we came on air about this 4-part series on the BBC iPlayer about the Rolling Stones. Each episode focuses on one of the individual Stones. And the episode on Mick Jagger was interesting because early on, and he talks about this as a sort of elderly 79-year-old man now, but he remembers going in his very early days, they were invited on to Ready, Steady, Go, which was the big pop show on TV. And he made a point of saying that he would go, Rory, and watch other acts do it when the Stones weren't on, because he wanted to watch all angles of things like the camera lines, where the audiences were, how the audiences moved, so that when he came to do his live performance, he knew exactly what he wanted to do two things. One is engage the audience, and two is engage the cameras. That's why I raised the point. So he's aware that when he's performing live, as it were, so everyone in their homes. And I thought the fact that he, as a sort of, young, upstart, rebellious singer, could be bothered to actually go and watch other people to check where the cameras and the lines were was absolutely fascinating.
There's a school of thought which said that all Trump's TV appearances beforehand, both on Wrestling and The Apprentice and so on, were hugely advantageous to him, because he'd come to instinctively understand, camera angles and so on. And there was some very weird bit of footage about him obsessing about the position of a glass, and everybody was thinking he was basically being a prima donna nut. But actually, of course, if you simply do it a lot, that becomes instinctive in a way that most politicians who aren't really used to being televised until they make a presidential run. I noticed it during lockdown, which is the fact that I'd made a few Radio 4 programmes where I'd mostly recorded the content at home. It didn't feel weird talking to a microphone. So if I had to record a bit of film myself during lockdown, other people found it deeply discomforting. And I said, yeah, so did I. But after 8 hours of doing it, or 20 hours of doing it, I suppose probably more, okay, it doesn't feel weird anymore. But that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, he was such a pro in every respect, wasn't he?
And that comes across
for a kind of rock god. Yeah. The combination of kind of rock god status and absolute hard professionalism is fascinating.
Well, the series is fascinating because you see how, and it focuses on the four of them that are still going. Well, three of them are still going, plus Charlie Watts. By the way, the Charlie Watts episode was the most interesting one of all, because Charlie Watts was the most unrolling stone like Rolling Stone you could ever imagine. He was such a decent, straight, ordinary gentleman, and that I think was the most interesting episode. But the whole thing, to me, whenever I watch something like about say a band, I can't help but thinking of it sort of in a business context. How do they as a team work together? How do the personalities fit in? Who's doing the hard lifting? Who's the front person? Who's providing the solid bass and rhythm at the back? And how do they all meld? And why have they gone on for so damn long? Because the fact they're so great, they've always been great, and survived that long is phenomenal. Because I mean, there's a lot of survivorship bias in when we look at sort of investors. Some people do well just because they survive, but these guys haven't just survived. They've been the top of their game for certainly the 60s, the 70s, and a little bit of the 80s, and they've just kept that going. And they now fill huge stadia. And they got something right that is worth bottling, I suspect.
And it's interesting, actually, because they navigated that transition away from records being the primary source of revenue to live shows perfectly. It's never been an issue for them. And so I like this, almost like if you looked at the sort of business model, to your point, they've got diversity in their boardroom. They bring different skills. They recognize that. And almost the rock and roll bit, yes, it's genuine for some of them, but it's also the professionalism that underpins it that allows that to happen.
Yeah. And what the documentary does show rather well is there are times when the band is under pressure for lots of reasons. Brian Jones dying, Mick and Keith falling out in the late 70s, and then Ronnie got them back together basically. And there's lots of interpersonal plays between them. The bit I think the show missed, they kind of, obviously Bill Wyman doesn't feature in it at all, which is a bit surprising, and I suspect that's his decision rather than anybody else's. But they glossed over the bit between Brian Jones dying and Ronnie Wood actually joining as a full-time member of the band. And they had a guitarist called Mick Taylor, who was pretty famous in his own right, and obviously has done things before and afterwards. I think he's worthy of great study. And they didn't really acknowledge him. He was a brilliant musician, and he added strings and stuff to some of the stuff and played the piano beautifully, and as well as being a great guitarist. But actually, if you look when he was actually with the band, they produced what is generally considered by Stones fans to be the best albums they ever had. Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street, for example. And then he disappears and Ronnie joins them, and then they become more, I think, better known as a live band, a sort of stadium-filling band later on as we get into the 80s. And so I think I just wonder what he brought coming in as a new boy, because he obviously did something right if they could then produce those three extraordinary albums when he joined them. And I'm minded back, and again, I'm sure a lot of listeners would have watched it, the Let It Be Beatles thing. And again, this is all about team dynamics and how you engage and how you basically re-energize your business, essentially. And those of you watching the Let It Be will have seen, the McCartney-Lennon relationship breaking down, or certainly a lot of tension. George Harrison in particular walking off set. What brought it all back together? It was the arrival of Billy Preston, who came in to play some keyboards. And from that scene alone in the documentary, you see everybody's, their eyes light up. They want to sing, they want to play together again. And I kind of wonder if Mick Taylor had that same sort of effect with the Stones. Because, we do sort of obsess in the business world about how do you get the right team in anything. And I think Rory's always said this to me, is that one of the problems with recruitment generally in most businesses, you recruit people one at a time. But you should be recruiting teams or groups, if you like, as a group to try and get those diverse personalities, those, should we call it cognitive diversity, which is, probably one of the key ingredients for any successful business, is to have cognitive diversity in the boardroom and out on the floor.
And I think the diversity pays off twice, because in one respect, it enables you to see things that other people wouldn't see, okay, which is, and it enables you to get lucky, if you like, if you have more diverse viewpoints. But there's also a massive security aspect to it, which is it prevents blind spots. So a film I probably watch several times a year would be The Big Short. I imagine that Paul does as well.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
And what is fascinating is you go to the Vegas conference, which is all about CDOs, okay, and everybody there is a believer. They all see the world in exactly the same way. It's patently in their financial interests not to actually spot any problems. And the only people who spot the problem, two things. One, they're weirdos, okay? And two, they do something that none of these people did, which is they go and have a look on the ground at who is buying these properties, okay? And they discover, what is it, a stripper in Florida who's got something like a massive property portfolio, on artificially low interest rates, just effectively to keep this machine running. And it's so interesting that the only people to spot it were this complete bunch of oddballs and misfits. And I think, there's a point that's often missed there, which is that it's very, very easy in a siloed business. In many ways, capitalism tends to fatten the wallet, but it does also narrow the mind. And it's interesting that the whole business of the division of labour, and Adam Smith spotted this, okay, one problem with the division of labour is it's also a division of attention. And, at the worst, of course, it makes jobs deeply boring and unattractive because you lose autonomy, but you also lose sight of the bigger picture of what you're doing. And, I think it is very important in that sense.
There's a 1999 film, which, if you haven't seen it, you should see, called Rogue Trader, which is about Nick Leeson at Bearings. And what comes across through in the film, which I think is pretty accurate, and we should ask Gerald Ashley, because I think he worked there at the time. But I think that when Leeson was making all these profits out in the Far East, the board back in London were very happy to accept them and sort of say, isn't he doing a good job? But there were definitely lots of people suspicious back in London. What the hell's he doing to be this successful? But no one actually bothered to say, well, we better look into it. Because as long as they were bringing in what they saw as huge profits coming in, and of course, that Bearings crisis was I just after I started my career back in the city in the mid-80s, and it was the first big, scandal, I think. And it was just, talk about lack of compliance.
Well, one of the most interesting things that the human brain does very well, which so far I'm not sure that artificial intelligence can do, is to absorb wider context, incommensurable, and sometimes seemingly irrelevant information into an overall decision. So I was in contact with some people who are looking to redesign the whole decision protocol for the launch of nuclear weapons. And we were talking about, of course, Petrov, I think the man who saved the world. The man who basically saw what appeared to be an American preemptive nuclear attack on the Soviet Union and refused to report it up, because he just decided it was a glitch. Now, this chap told me that there were two things which were really important, which often aren't told about that story. One of which is it seemed to show 9 missiles. And Petrov just thought, look, it's highly unlikely if you're going to do a preemptive attack, you're going to do it with 9. You might do it with 900. There might be some freak circumstances where you do it with 1, okay? But 9 looks really odd. Okay. The second thing was that the software had been updated 24 hours before. And so this guy thought, okay, it is disproportionately likely that we'll get false positives after a software update. Had the software been the same software which had been running for 7 years and not reported anything, his actions might have been different. Now, those two things aren't really what you might call, they aren't mathematically expressible pieces of information, necessarily, okay? Recency of software update, nature of attack, okay? But what the human brain can do is take information which isn't really commensurable, things like, if you like, price versus quality, and it can actually make a decision. And this is why I think B2B decision making is often worse than consumer decision making, because the need to actually show you're working out prevents you from using facets of the brain which in evolutionary terms have undoubtedly been honed and improved and are probably quite valuable. I once remember a case where I was sent to sort of evaluate this new business prospect, and I thought there was something wrong, okay, in the sense that the guy appeared to have a £90,000 watch, and there was something a bit odd about the whole setup, okay? But I felt I can't really go back and just go, no, something feels a bit off, okay? So I kind of went back and said, well, I can't see any evidence not to proceed with this business. And in fairness, there were some aspects of the business that were quite attractive and intelligent. But it later turned out that the whole thing was a front for the Malmo Mafia or something, okay? I can't imagine a Swedish mafia, but apparently there is one, which is quite interesting. If you end up with a dead herring in your bed, I don't know what the hell's going on, right? But apparently there is a Swedish mafia. It's something the Coen brothers would probably make a film about, isn't it? But it was interesting because we undoubtedly factor into decisions extraordinary pieces of information which are necessarily exogenous to any model of decision making. I always make this point that when we buy a second-hand car from someone, we actually assess the person as well as the car. Okay, yep. So here's an exercise. I always give this example of an exercise. You turn up to buy a second-hand car. It's parked outside the house. You like the look of it. You think you might pay $5,000 for it, and then you ring on the doorbell to talk to the owner. And in one universe, the door's opened by a vicar or rabbi or whatever. Okay, now in that instant, you probably reappraise upwards how much you're prepared to pay. And in the other situation, the door is opened by a man in his underpants. Now, the reason I choose this is it's someone who is clearly immune to shame, okay? If you open the door to strangers in your underpants, patently you're not someone who's reputationally sensitive. Now, in that situation, you probably decide not to buy the car or you revise what you're prepared to pay downwards. Even though it has nothing to do with the car, it has a bearing on those aspects of the car that you can't really measure. How well it's been serviced, how well it's been looked after, and the level of shame that the seller would experience in selling something which subsequently proved to be defective. Okay, I've always asked this question. My mum didn't know anything about cars, but knew a lot about people. Okay, and if you had 5 AA engineers who went to a car auction, they knew nothing about the previous car's seller, but they could simply evaluate the cars from a mechanical standpoint, and you pitted them against my mum, who didn't even look at the cars but judged the 5 people you were most likely to trust buying a second-hand car from, famously not Richard Nixon, of course. That was that wonderful attack on Nixon. Would you buy a second-hand car from this man? Okay, I'm not sure that my mum wouldn't do a better job. My mum's dead now, so it's an experiment we can never do. But it's nonetheless it has an interesting bearing on being forced to only make decisions around what seems to be immediately relevant and salient, relevant and important. What is this car like? What's its mileage? Well, if you don't trust the guy who's selling you the car, the mileage of the car now becomes a pretty dubious piece of data because he could have clocked it. And so, it's one of those things that, I think brand preference uses that instinctive thing, which is someone who is a famous brand is going to be much more reluctant to sell a bad product than someone I've never heard of. I think it's a perfectly rational response to information. Similarly, you could argue that habit and collective copying, social proof, aren't irrational. They may be, they may be described as biases, but actually factoring in the behaviour of other people with complementary knowledge to your own into your decision hardly seems to me to be, irrational. And in an evolutionary setting, okay, you could argue that any organism that would only learn from its own mistakes and not learn from the mistakes of others has a massive evolutionary disadvantage.
And that's really interesting, because that brings me sort of into something I've heard referred to as anecdata, which I rather like, the combination of anecdotes and data. And the whole Jeff Bezos philosophy of we get both anecdotes and data, and we see whether, and if there's a difference between the two, we get more anecdotes.
We trust the anecdotes. He said when the data conflicts with the anecdotes, it usually turns out that the anecdotes are true. There's a famous story about someone presenting to him about I think it was call centre response times. Very attractive graphs on call centre response times. And Jeff Bezos just picks up the phone, rings the number, and he doesn't get answered and basically fires the guy. Okay? Because, it is also worth noting that, unlike physics, where measurement provides you with objective information, most of the information we're actually processing has been compiled by people who have an agenda of their own. To be honest, one of the great mistakes is to assume that any data set, let's say you have something like the average of this is that, okay? And we treat the average of this as that as if it's a fact. It isn't really a fact. It's the bastard child of an unrepresentative set of information combined with a point of view, to be honest. Because someone's chosen to average that because they don't want you to know about the variance. And what's probably the case, the average call answering time might have been quite good because the guy was factoring in the fact that on Amazon you can click a button and get them to call you. In which case you're going to answer the phone pretty quickly, right? Right, and he was probably including that data in the data set to make himself look good.
Yeah, averages, just that very word, when I see that anywhere, I just immediately, my suspicious hackles go up. Someone said, well, the average person has one testicle and one ovary. It sort of leads me on to the point where when we look at averages, there's obviously no intention when one uses them to think about anything like statistical frequency. At least a bloody median as opposed to a mean gives you some sort of sense of it, and the mode probably gives you an even better one.
Yeah.
What's the most common reading as opposed to what's the average reading? And there was a very interesting.
So this is one of my arguments in the Transport for Humans book, which is that the average time saving, okay, or aggregate time saving from high speed 2 doesn't make the distinction between 1,000 people saving an hour once a year and one person saving an hour 1,000 times. Well, yeah, not that you would. Okay, 5 people saving an hour 200 times a year, right? Okay, now, by the way, I'll be fair about this. I'm not sure that remote working doesn't strengthen the case for high speed 2. Because my argument was there would never be people who'd travel into London from Manchester 5 days a week, okay? Now there may be people who travel into London from Manchester once a week. And for them, high speed 2 is a big deal, okay? Because they're going to be saving, a couple of hours 50 times a year. That's sort of life-changing. You get a few days of your life back. For the 1,000 people who save an hour once a year, or the 100 people who save an hour 10 times a year, what you're talking about is a convenience. You're not talking about a game changer. And so that the very act of aggregation basically destroys judgment in many cases, because it gets you into that territory of the single representative agent.
Yeah, and I noticed that the other day there was something on Twitter I was looking at. It sounds a bit dry, but it was talking about the average wealth per adult in the different countries, and again use the word average, and of course when people typically use that stat, they throw that around. They talk about the mean, and so somewhere like the US comes out very high on the mean, very high indeed.
Yes.
But once you go to the median, it drops down to something like 26th in the world, because the median wealth per adult in the US is considerably lower because of the very small amount of incredibly wealthy people in the US, which
Yes.
affects the mean, but doesn't really affect the median. And of course, the mode might be an even better. And I mean, these sort of technical averages, median, mean, and mode, they're actually relatively simple concepts. But it disappoints me that, particularly in the media, everyone just focuses on the mean the whole time and normally aggregates stuff that shouldn't be aggregated together anyway. And it reminds me of, I think you and I were talking in the pub once, Rory, many years ago, about are we teaching the wrong sort of maths in schools? Because, I mean, who's ever going to work out the bloody surface area of a cone in their real life unless they're an engineer? But we should be learning about basic stats and probability, just because that confronts us every day of our lives in the real world, potentially.
I totally buy that.
And I think this isn't this Gerd Gigerenza's point? Yeah, I think Gerd Gigerenza makes the point, to be fair. It's his idea.
Risk Savvy, probably, yeah. Great book.
But let's teach the right sort of maths to kids before they leave school, rather than hypothetical stuff they'll never use again, because this is really practical and it's good for the mind. I mean,
well, there's a really interesting thing, which is there was a high school, Chinese maths question recently, which went massively viral because it actually said a ship contains something like 25 sheep and 15 goats. Okay, what is the age of the captain? Okay. Now, apparently there is a technical answer to this, which is that you have to have a certain qualification to pilot a ship over a certain weight. So the technically correct answer is he has to be over 25 because otherwise he's not old enough to qualify for his heavy ship master's qualification in China. Okay, but no. The correct answer, which is the only correct answer, is not enough information. Okay, the reason it arose is they borrowed it from a 1980s French behavioural science experiment, which, funnily enough, also used sheep and goats in the age of the captain. And they discovered that a significant minority of people actually added up the number of sheep and goats to make the age of the captain. Okay? Right? I mean, this is like, 30%, 35% of people would actually just go, he's 40. Right? And they go, this is totally weird. And then you realise that everybody's been taught from generations of maths questions that you have the information within the question to solve the question, and also no other extraneous information, by the way, as well. Because maths questions are this weird stripped down thing of a completely artificial situation where two buses leave a point at noon, one travels due north at 40 kilometres an hour, one travels due west at 30 kilometres an hour. What time is it when they are 100 kilometres apart? Okay, and the answer is 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Okay, 3, 4, right angle, triangle, hypotenuse, 3, 4, 5, boom, okay? Now, in the real world, first of all, buses don't travel at a constant speed. They don't travel a straight line, okay? So you can forget about those two assumptions to start with. Secondly, in the real world, there's a load of extraneous information as well, okay? All right, which you have to learn to ignore. And what they discovered is people had been so conditioned by maths questions to say, basically, use whatever data is in the question to arrive at a single right answer, that they would do this even when the entire assumption is nonsensical. And so they were very reluctant to say, they just hadn't been trained to say, not enough information to answer this question. And it's very similar, I think, to Daniel Kahneman's idea of Whizziati, what you see is all there is.
Yep.
Okay, which is you go to people, I've got a young, very well qualified, but not very experienced candidate. I've got an experienced candidate, but his qualifications aren't quite so good. And obviously, he went to university 10 years ago, so some of his thinking may be out of date. But on the other hand, he's got proven experience. Which one should I choose? And people give an answer to that question. They very rarely say, I'm sorry, I need more information before I can answer this. And there may be an evolutionary reason for this, which is, in evolutionary terms, making a non-catastrophic decision with the information you have immediately to hand, by which I mean making a quick, reasonably good decision, is probably advantageous in evolutionary terms. Because most questions of survival in the ancestral environment didn't allow for time for deliberation. Are there more lions round the corner? Can we find out? Can we find out? Because before I run off in that direction, I really need to know about the distribution of lions versus run like fuck. Okay. In evolutionary terms, speed of decision making was probably disproportionately rewarded.
But the danger now in the business sense, though, is if you use something as crude as a mean.
Yeah.
To base your decisions on, which I think a lot of people, and I would include myself here, by the way, I'm sure in my life I've done it many times, without actually thinking about things like frequency and comparing it with the median and the mode. I mean, just that example I gave you earlier about the US, it's extraordinary. I just looked it up, the numbers.
And actually, if you're an unborn child and you have to decide which country you're born into, okay, the median is actually what you choose, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. So let's give you an example. The United States, which is, according to the mean wealth per adult in the US, is $505,000, right? the mean. The median is only $79,000.
Yeah.
But everyone's quoting the mean when they talk about US and the US wealth and everything else. And again, and Switzerland's the same. But it's extraordinary how people just, and is it lazy or is it just a shortcut because it saves time? But it's missing the point. It's kind of using the mean as there's my stat to back up my argument, but it's not looking below it. And I think that's a real danger.
And I think also the fact that, of course, the ensemble mean isn't representative of the time series outcome.
Ergodicity.
The ergodicity question. So if you looked at average customer satisfaction, you could improve that quite a lot and have no real benefit. Because, to be honest, if you're interested in customer retention, the thing you've got to really avoid is 3 bad experiences in a row. If customers have a bad experience and you sort it out, they actually often end up more loyal and more content than they were before the problem occurred. Because your reserves of decency, I suppose, have been tested and not found wanting. They're now more confident in the relationship because there's some element of reciprocation involved, okay? You know, I bought my car from you and this thing's broken. I had this, don't worry, we'll sort that out for you for free. Oh, okay. Now, by contrast, what I think we're doing in a lot of online businesses is you go online and you can't solve the problem. That's problem number 1. Then you pick up the phone and they don't answer. Now you've had problem number 2. And then when you finally get through, they fob you off to someone else, cut you off. You know, they don't solve the problem. You've now had 3 problems in a row. And nobody's spotted this, you see, because they're probably measuring online satisfaction separately from telephone satisfaction, forgetting the fact that actually dissatisfaction in one probably is leading to dissatisfaction in the other. And so it's a really important point, which is that you can actually make your averages look pretty attractive, as the United States has done, without actually improving the lot of overall humanity very much at all.
Hi, it's Christian here. You probably don't recognise my voice because I haven't said very much on this show, but you can see why. The point of getting Paul and Rory together was to let them be themselves. I think we succeeded. The good news is that this is just the halfway point in their discussion, and you can hear part 2 of the conversation on the next episode, which is the 200th of the show. I can't think of a better way to launch the 3rd century of the podcast. Obviously, if you're listening to this after the next episode comes out, the best thing to do is just crack on and listen to it. If you're listening before it's come out, then do look in the show notes for links to around 6 hours of previous episodes featuring Paul and Rory. If you're new to the show or Human Risk, you can subscribe on whichever podcasting platform you use to get your quality audio content. And you can learn more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients at human-risk.com. Coming up next on the show is the 200th episode. Since you've heard this one, you've got a very good idea of what's yet to come. So stay tuned for that, stay safe, and thank you so much for listening.